What happens to a city in the exact moment its walls fall, not in the tales carved by victors, but in the corridors where no torchlight ever reaches? And more importantly, what happens to the women who stand in that silent space between conquest and survival, the space historians rarely dared to document? When an invading army storms through broken gates, the world sees the banners, the battles, the smoke rising from collapsed homes. But the real story, the one whispered between generations and buried beneath centuries of shame, begins after the swords lower. It begins when soldiers stop fighting men and start deciding the fate of women whose lives are suddenly stripped of identity, protection, and voice. This moment, this fracture in the fabric of a city, is where the darkest machinery of conquest reveals itself. Throughout ancient and medieval history, chronicles describe tactical brilliance, heroic resistance, and grand political transformations. But behind those narratives lies a truth far more disturbing. Women became the first currency of domination. Conquerors understood that subjugating a population required more than seizing land. It demanded dismantling the emotional and cultural heart of the defeated, and nothing accomplished that more efficiently than taking control of the women left behind. These weren't impulsive acts of cruelty. They were deliberate strategies, enforced with chilling consistency across empires that prided themselves on discipline and order. What the public saw as victory, the commanders saw as logistics, and what the soldiers enacted became an unspoken extension of military policy. Imagine the sound of boots echoing through narrow streets while the smoke of burning temples coils around shattered rooftops, women hiding in storerooms clutching their children, praying the invaders will pass them by. Others lined up for inspection as if they were war spoils catalogued in a ledger. Age, beauty, social position, marital status, every detail weighed as though value could be calculated by a glance. Some were taken by individual soldiers, others reserved for officers, and many more designated as collective property of the occupying force. Each decision carved a permanent scar not only on the women themselves, but on the entire conquered society. Families broke, communities fractured, and cultural memory splintered into silence. And here lies the most unsettling truth. Even the commanders, hardened by war and trained to endure, the worst humanity could produce, often found themselves shaken by what their own armies became behind closed doors. Reports buried in archives describe leaders who recoiled at the brutality unfolding in the aftermath of their victories, men who expected carnage on the battlefield but were unprepared for the orchestrated suffering that followed. These are the stories that rarely appear in official chronicles because they expose the machinery of conquest not as a political triumph, but as a systematic assault on the vulnerable. You might be wondering why these accounts were erased, why entire volumes gloss over what happened after the gates fell. Stay with this narrative, because the patterns you're about to discover reveal how violence against women became a silent but essential weapon of empires. Before we move on, tell me in the comments what this opening awakened in you. Leave your like so this investigation reaches more people, and make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss the next revelations that will unfold naturally from here as we continue to unravel what history tried to bury. The machinery of conquest did not pause once the gates were breached. It simply changed shape. After the initial chaos faded, a colder, more calculated system emerged, one that treated women not as individuals, but as instruments through which psychological control could spread across an entire defeated population. Conquerors understood that the women of an invaded city carried its memory, its generational continuity, its cultural teachings, and its emotional core. To dominate them was to dismantle the story the city told about itself. Soldiers became agents of a deeper strategy, one that extended far beyond plunder. They were instructed, both explicitly and implicitly, that breaking the spirit of conquered women ensured the submissiveness of the surviving men, the compliance of elders, and the silence of future generations. Violence became a language of domination. spoken through gestures meant to fracture identity and erase dignity. The transformation began in small, chillingly organized steps. Women were separated from their families, forced into lines where officers assessed them with the same detached scrutiny they used on seized livestock or captured weapons. In some empires, this process was ritualized, overseen by scribes who documented each woman's origin, physical attributes, and appropriate use. In others, the decisions were left to the instincts of seasoned commanders who believed that breaking the will of a newly conquered city required striking at its most intimate foundation. The mere act of inspection, of reducing a human being to an object of value, served as a warning echoing through the ruins. The city no longer belonged to itself. In these moments, women became unwilling symbols of conquest, and their pain became a message delivered without the need for written decrees or sculpted monuments. What happened to them flowed through the streets and into the hearts of every surviving citizen. A husband's helplessness, a father's shame, a brother's rage. These emotions fused into a collective paralysis. Empires learned to manipulate this paralysis, to wield it as effectively as any sword. Soldiers reported that entire districts would fall silent after these acts, as if the city itself understood that resistance had become futile. The psychological effect was immediate and overwhelming, spreading faster than any physical destruction. Even among the conquerors, these acts carried a dual purpose. They bonded soldiers through shared transgression, creating a sense of unity rooted not in loyalty or honor, but in complicity. Commanders recognized that men who crossed certain moral thresholds together were easier to control, easier to direct, and less likely to question orders. The brutality committed against women thus served to discipline not only the conquered population, but also the army itself. A soldier who had participated in, or even merely witnessed, these acts became part of an unspoken pact, one that tied his identity to the success of the conquest and buried any hesitation beneath layers of collective guilt. Meanwhile, the women caught in this unfolding horror were forced to navigate a reality stripped of familiarity. Some attempted to negotiate, offering knowledge, skills, or silence in exchange for mercy. Others clung to fragments of identity, whispering the names of ancestors or praying, in languages the conquerors did not understand. Their defiance often took forms too subtle to record in chronicles, the way they held a child's hand, the refusal to cry, the steady gaze that unsettled even hardened soldiers. These quiet acts became the last threads connecting them to the world that had been taken from them. Yet as the conquerors began to settle in, transforming the captured city into an extension of their empire, the systematic appropriation of women became the underlying rhythm that shaped the new order. And it is here, in this uneasy coexistence of dominance and silence, that the true depth of the invaders' strategy begins to reveal itself, pulling us into the deeper layers of what history chose not to preserve, but which lived on in the memories of those who survived, even when no one dared to speak of it aloud. The deeper one looks into the aftermath of an invasion, the clearer it becomes that the treatment of women was never a chaotic byproduct of war, but a structured extension of military policy. Behind the smoke-filled streets and shattered homes, a hidden bureaucracy came alive, one designed to classify, distribute, and control women with a precision that mirrored the empire's handling of grain, weapons, or tribute. Once the initial terror settled, soldiers herded women into designated points: courtyards, temples stripped of their sacred objects, abandoned merchant halls, or makeshift enclosures built from the ruins. Here the process took on a chilling sense of order, as if the conquerors believed that organizing suffering granted them legitimacy. Scribes or appointed officers moved among the gathered women with wax tablets or parchment scrolls, noting names when names were offered, or assigning designations when identities had already been erased. Age categories were recorded not with human concern, but with the detached practicality of inventory. Younger women were often marked for the personal use of officers or sold to high-ranking households far from the conquered city. Older women were assigned labor, distributed as servants, or left to the whims of soldiers whose motivations flickered between cruelty, boredom, and the desire to assert power. Those considered defiant, noble-born, or simply too proud to bow their heads were separated for discipline, a word that, in the language of Conquest, carried meanings that would never be written but were universally understood. The act of cataloging served a purpose, far beyond documentation. It stripped women of their social roles, mother, wife, daughter, artisan, priestess, and replaced them with labels that fit the invader's needs. This erosion of identity was deliberate. A woman who no longer belonged to a community became easier to control. A woman who carried no official name became easier to forget. The conquerors knew that memory itself was a form of resistance, so they sought to dismantle it with bureaucratic efficiency. Many records were later absorbed into imperial archives, not as testimonies of suffering but as logistical reports, devoid of emotion, cold as stone. Between these lines, a harrowing truth emerges. Commanders often claimed this system prevented chaos, but in reality, it institutionalized domination. Soldiers moved down the rows, making selections with a gesture, a nod, a touch on the shoulder. Some women tried to appear older, roughening their faces with ash or hiding their hair. Others attempted to shield daughters or sisters, placing themselves forward in desperate bids to divert attention. A few whispered to each other in coded fragments of familiar songs or prayers, clinging to any symbol that reminded them they once belonged to a world where dignity was not a luxury. What haunted many witnesses, even among the conquerors, was how quickly this machinery adapted to each population. Cities from vastly different cultures, Greek, Persian, Berber, Celtic, Gothic, were absorbed into the same brutal rhythm. Their women processed through the same cold rituals. The empire's methods did not change. It was the women who changed within them, each bringing a history the conquerors sought to erase. Among the captives were healers, scribes, merchants' wives, priestesses who knew the language of ritual, girls barely old enough to understand the weight of what was happening, and elders who had lived through previous wars but never imagined this kind of systemized humiliation. And without written resistance, without chronicles authored by those who suffered, the record of these processes became shadows cast on the walls of history, pieced together only through fragments, testimonies whispered across generations, and the rare documents that escaped destruction. Yet the rhythm of that machinery, the quiet shuffling of women forced into lines to be classified like spoils, remained the unspoken foundation upon which the conquerors built their authority. And as the occupying armies prepared to entrench themselves further into the life of the city, a new layer of cruelty was about to unfold, one that even seasoned commanders struggled to justify as they witnessed the consequences of the system they had helped create. As the occupying forces settled into the conquered city, an unsettling pattern began to surface, one that exposed the moral fractures even within the ranks of those who had marched in with confidence and authority. Commanders who had spent years navigating the brutal logic of war often found themselves confronted with scenes they could neither sanction nor fully stop. Reports buried in forgotten archives describe officers who entered captured districts expecting to see men rebuilding barricades or families negotiating surrender, only to witness rooms where soldiers acted with such unrestrained cruelty that even hardened veterans hesitated at the threshold. What the conquerors inflicted on women did not follow the familiar rules of battle. It belonged to a different realm, one where dominance was not measured in territory, but in the complete collapse of human dignity. Some commanders attempted to re-establish order, issuing commands meant to restrain their troops, but the chaos had already become part of the army's rhythm. Soldiers intoxicated by victory felt untouchable, freed from the discipline that once governed them. Their brutality did not arise from desperation or fear. It emerged from a collective certainty that no action would bring consequences, and this certainty grew each time a commander turned away, torn between the need to maintain authority and the recognition that his own position was held together by fragile threads of loyalty. Many reported feeling as if they were watching their army dissolve into something primal, something that mirrored the chaos they had supposedly been sent to end. In the narrow streets and abandoned courtyards, women bore the weight of this collapse. Some soldiers pushed past one another in competitions that blurred the line between violence and spectacle, as though cruelty itself had become a currency traded within the ranks. The city, once filled with market chatter and children's laughter, now echoed with sounds that commanders could not erase from memory. Those who had once prided themselves on leading disciplined troops found themselves wrestling with a kind of shame they could not voice, aware that they were witnessing not just the subjugation of a conquered population, but the moral unraveling of their own men. A few tried to intervene quietly, ordering certain areas closed off or forbidding their soldiers from entering designated quarters. But these gestures, though noble in intention, did little to stem the tide. The machinery of conquest, once set in motion, rarely responded to the conscience of individuals. Rumors circulated among officers about the youngest soldiers, the ones who had never seen true battle, losing themselves entirely in acts that horrified even the most experienced veterans. The lines between punishment, pleasure, and power blurred in ways that commanders found impossible to articulate in official reports. In later years, some of these officers would write that the fall of the city felt like two invasions unfolding at once, one against the people they had conquered, and another against the humanity of the army that carried their banners. They admitted privately that what shook them most was not the devastation of war, but the realization that conquest could transform ordinary men into instruments of torment without a single order being given. It was a revelation they carried long after the campaign ended, lingering like a shadow over every future victory. And as these contradictions deepened, the women trapped within the ruins endured the full impact of a system collapsing into moral darkness, their suffering becoming the silent ledger of an empire that refused to acknowledge the cost of its own triumphs. Tell me in the comments what struck you most in this part of the story, and what emotions or thoughts it stirred as you followed this unfolding truth. The march of the conquered did not end when the soldiers claimed the streets. It merely shifted shape as women were gathered, separated, and pushed into forced journeys that erased any trace of the lives they once knew. For many, the ordeal began with a tug at the arm, a shout in an unfamiliar language, or the cold touch of a soldier's hand guiding them toward a future they could neither predict nor resist. These women were no longer seen as citizens of a fallen city, but as spoils that could be moved, traded, transported, or hidden, depending on the needs of the conquerors. And so began the long process of displacement, a journey that stretched across fields, mountains, ports, and caravan roads, where their identities dissolved into the machinery of imperial expansion. Some were escorted in long columns, tied with ropes to prevent escape, forced to walk in silence as soldiers rode alongside them. Others were carried off individually, claimed by officers and brought into military encampments just outside the city walls. The farther they moved from the ruins of their homes, the more disoriented they became, not only because of distance, but because every step felt like another layer of memory peeling away. Their names, once spoken with affection by family or neighbors, were gradually replaced by labels assigned by captors, reducing them to mere tokens in a system too vast and impersonal to acknowledge their voices. In the temporary camps erected beyond the city's edge, the hierarchy of ownership became painfully clear. Officers inspected the new captives as if determining the quality of goods unloaded from a ship. Some women were placed under the direct control of elite units, expected to serve in secluded quarters where soldiers rotated in and out with the same cold regularity seen in the distribution of rations. Others were selected for transport deeper into the empire, destined for households that valued foreign captives as symbols of prestige. These transfers created an unspoken understanding among the conquered. The farther one was taken, the less likely they would ever see familiar faces again. Yet the most haunting journeys were those not recorded in any ledger. Women dragged from the city were often marched past the bodies of those who had resisted, past broken shrines, past piles of belongings stripped from homes, each sight deepening the sense of a world that had blinked out of existence. Occasionally, in moments when the guards grew careless or distracted, women exchanged brief glances or whispered fragments of their old lives to those walking beside them. These fleeting connections became lifelines, reminders that their existence had once been defined by something other than suffering. But the machinery of assimilation worked quickly. As the days passed, many women found themselves unable to recall the exact arrangement of streets in their old city, the sound of their own marketplaces, or the way the light filtered through familiar windows at dawn. The conquerors relied on this erosion of memory. It made the women easier to absorb into new environments, easier to train, easier to forget. Those taken to distant provinces were often presented as trophies to local officials who knew nothing of their past and cared even less. They were placed into households where their silence was expected, where every task served as a reminder that their identity had been replaced by duty. The emotional toll of this uprooting pressed heavily on them. Some tried to preserve fragments of their former selves by repeating family names or recalling rituals in the quiet moments before dawn. Others resisted by refusing to speak the conqueror's language, clinging stubbornly to the cadence of their childhood. But many, worn down by exhaustion, fear, and the constant presence of their captors, slipped into a state that left them neither fully present nor entirely gone. Their survival depended not on strength alone, but on the ability to adapt to a life rewritten by the hands of those who viewed them as pieces in a larger imperial narrative. And as the empire stretched outward, swallowing city after city, the experiences of these women became threads woven into a tapestry of silence, one that history rarely paused to examine, even as it shaped the foundations of entire civilizations. What unfolded next within conquered cities was not merely violence, but a deliberate strategy crafted to break entire populations through the targeted humiliation of women. Empires understood something chillingly simple. To shatter the morale of a defeated people, one needed only to strike at those who symbolized continuity, lineage, and the intimate heart of the community. Women became the battleground upon which the conquerors imposed their authority. Their suffering transformed into a silent proclamation that resistance had ended. The brutality inflicted on them was never random. It was calculated to echo through homes, families, and generations long after the soldiers left. In many campaigns, officers issued tacit approvals for acts that would never appear in official decrees, but were widely understood among the ranks. It was enough for a commander to look away, enough for him to step outside a room, enough for him to allow the door to close without comment. Soldiers quickly learned that the humiliation of women served a psychological purpose larger than any battlefield maneuver. When the women of a city were subdued, shamed, or visibly dominated, the surviving men often collapsed under the weight of their own powerlessness. Fathers who had once walked confidently through marketplaces now stared at the ground, unable to reconcile their role as protectors with the reality forced upon them. Sons who had dreamed of becoming warriors found themselves stripped of courage by the sight of their mothers' or sisters' suffering. Husbands carried a guilt so pervasive it robbed them of their will to rebuild. The conquerors exploited this paralysis with precision. They knew that while fortifications could be rebuilt and armies reformed, the psychological wound inflicted through the suffering of women sank deeper than stone walls or military defeat. It attacked the collective identity of the city, creating fractures that made rebellion less likely, compliance more certain, and the imperial presence easier to solidify. Villages that had once defiantly resisted taxation or occupation became subdued after witnessing the consequences imposed on female captives. Entire districts fell silent, avoiding gatherings, rituals, or discussions that once defined community life. Silence itself became the new law, enforced not through decrees, but through trauma. Some soldiers pushed this strategy further by turning humiliation into spectacle. Women were forced into public spaces, their suffering displayed in ways designed to provoke despair rather than outrage, because outrage could spark revolt, but despair dissolved resistance. The conquerors understood that terror, when rooted in shame, becomes self-policing. Families avoided speaking of what had happened, fearing the erosion of their own honor. Communities turned inward, unwilling to confront the depth of the violation. This silence allowed the conquerors to move through the city uncontested, their power reaffirmed with every unspoken memory. Yet the response of the women themselves was complex and varied. Some endured in silence, retreating into the depths of their minds to protect the fragments of identity they refused to relinquish. Others resisted in small, unseen ways, refusing to weep, refusing to bow their heads, refusing to let the conquerors witness their despair. These subtle acts of defiance unsettled soldiers who expected submission. A steady gaze, a quiet refusal to speak, or a whispered prayer became symbols of an inner world the invaders could not fully conquer. But even these acts were fraught with danger, for the invaders recognized that unresolved defiance could inspire others, and they responded with measures meant to crush even the faintest spark of resistance. Meanwhile, the architecture of the city itself seemed to absorb this new reality. Market squares that once echoed with bargaining voices now carried the weight of unspoken stories. Doorways that had witnessed festivals and family gatherings became thresholds of fear. And as the conquerors tightened their grip, using the humiliation of women as the quiet thread binding the city beneath their rule, the next phase of cruelty began to take shape, one that revealed just how deeply the empire's strategies penetrated the private lives of those it subdued. As the conquerors tightened their hold on the broken city, the machinery of domination evolved into something even more pointed, targeting women with punishments crafted not only to subdue them, but to send a message that no act of defiance, no matter how small, would be tolerated. These punishments were not improvised outbursts of cruelty. They were deliberate, ritualized performances of power meant to be witnessed, absorbed, and remembered by everyone who still breathed within the conquered walls. The women chosen for these acts were often those whose spirit had not been extinguished, those who refused to bow, who tried to protect, a child who spoke a forbidden prayer, or who simply carried themselves with pride despite the conquering army's attempts to strip it away. Commanders, seeking to cement their authority, sometimes ordered public displays meant to crush the city's remaining sense of identity. Women were forced into squares where their suffering became a warning, carved not into stone, but into collective memory. These punishments varied from region to region, shaped by the customs of the invading force, yet their purpose remained painfully consistent, to prove that rebellion, even in thought, was a path to ruin. Soldiers gathered, not out of necessity, but because participation, whether active or passive, pulled them deeper into the emotional machinery of conquest, binding them to the empire's will through acts that scarred their own humanity. The victims selected for these displays often represented more than themselves. They were daughters of respected families, women who held roles in religious communities, or wives of men who had dared to resist even in the final moments of the invasion. Their suffering became symbolic, a calculated strike against the heart of the city. To watch a beloved figure broken in such a public way was to feel the spine of the entire community bend. Rumors circulated quickly in the aftermath, each retelling blurring into fragments of dread that reached every house, every alley, every gathering place. Families learned to speak carefully, to move quietly, to hope for invisibility. Yet in these events, an unsettling tension often rippled through the ranks of the conquerors. Some soldiers were shaken by the extremity of what they were instructed or allowed to do. A few turned away, unable to watch, their faces tightening in silent conflict. But silence was survival. A soldier who questioned orders risked becoming a target himself, for cruelty had become the currency of belonging within the occupying force. The punishments performed on women served, not only to terrorize the conquered, but also to measure the loyalty and brutality of those tasked with enforcing imperial rule. When the punishments were finished, the city seemed to hold its breath. The air thickened with the kind of quiet that settles over a place where something irreversible has occurred. The spaces where these acts unfolded remained tainted, avoided even by soldiers who had once marched through them with ease. Women who survived the punishments carried marks that went far, beyond physical injuries. Their presence alone reminded others of what resistance cost. Some were abandoned to their fate, others dragged away to unknown destinations, and a few disappeared entirely, their absence becoming its own form of warning. In the days that followed, families clung to each other in desperate attempts to rebuild a semblance of safety, but the shadow of those punishments lingered. The conquerors had shown that they did not merely rule through the sword, they ruled through fear, enacted on the bodies of those least able to defend themselves. And as the weight of these events settled into the bones of the city, it became clear that the next stage of domination would move from open displays to quieter, more insidious forms, embedding the empire's control not only in the streets, but in the very structure of daily life. Tell me in the comments which part of this unfolding truth struck you the hardest as you followed this chapter of the story. As the shock of public punishments faded into a grim, collective memory, the empire shifted to a quieter but equally devastating strategy, absorbing the conquered women into an administrative system that processed human lives with the same cold precision used to manage taxes, land, and military supplies. What happened behind closed doors, in storage rooms repurposed into registration chambers or in dim corridors lined with guards, revealed the depth of the conqueror's intentions. Women were no longer seen as remnants of a defeated city. They became entries in ledgers, numbers in inventories, classified objects whose fate could be decided with a stroke of a quill. Imperial scribes, trained to interpret orders without questioning their morality, documented each captive as meticulously as they recorded shipments of grain. Some women were listed by approximate age when no name was offered, others by physical traits that reduced their humanity to descriptive fragments. The conquerors used categories such as labor suitability, compliance levels, or household value, applying them with a detached efficiency that stripped away the last traces of identity the women tried so desperately to cling to. The silence in these rooms was suffocating, broken only by the scratching of reeds on parchment and the low murmurs of guards ensuring compliance. The most disturbing aspect of this system was how thoroughly it erased the past. A woman who had once belonged to a respected family, who had woven patterns for temples or sung in festivals, became indistinguishable from another captured days earlier in a distant province. Her origin, her traditions, her attachments evaporated under the weight of imperial classification. This was not an accident. It was a strategy designed to sever continuity. A population without memory was easier to reshape, easier to integrate into the machinery of empire, easier to command. Once processed, the women were dispatched according to the needs of the occupying force or the demands of administrators stationed across the region. Some were assigned as servants to officers who believed possession equated to legitimacy. Others were transported in guarded caravans to distant estates, where they would spend the rest of their lives serving in environments that viewed them as foreign acquisitions rather than human beings. A few were sent to temples newly repurposed by the conquerors, where they were forced to adopt the rituals, language, and expectations of a culture, not their own. These placements were not random. They were designed to disperse the women so widely that their shared memories dissolved into isolation. Even harsher was the category reserved for those deemed unsuitable for domestic integration, but still considered valuable. These women were often assigned to labor-intensive tasks in imperial workshops, granaries, or weaving halls, where oversight was strict and escape impossible. In these places, they worked in near silence, surrounded by others who had undergone the same erasure, each woman carrying a story she had no opportunity to speak aloud. Over time, their gestures became mechanical, their voices muted, their identities flattened by repetition and exhaustion. And yet, despite the conquerors' efforts to impose order through documentation, something always resisted beneath the surface. Women formed small alliances in whispered conversations, sharing fragments of language, old songs, or details of a ritual they refused to let die. Sometimes a scribe noticed a look exchanged between captives, or a pattern of subtle defiance. These moments, though brief, revealed a truth the empire could never fully eliminate. That identity, even when suppressed, finds ways to survive. But the conquerors understood the threat posed by these small sparks, and so their system tightened further, embedding control into every stage of the process. In time, the ledgers themselves became a map of domination, each line a testament to how thoroughly the empire sought to reshape the conquered world. And as the administrative machinery expanded, it began to absorb not only bodies but narratives, deciding which stories would be remembered and which would vanish into the quiet corridors where no history book ever wandered. The trauma left in the wake of Conquest did not disappear when the soldiers marched onward, or when the empire's banners were replaced with new ones centuries later. It settled instead into the bones of the city, into the memories of families who survived, and into the unspoken stories carried through generations. The women who endured these invasions became vessels of a sorrow that could not be openly named, their experiences so heavy and dangerous that even whispering them risked reopening wounds the community had no strength to confront. Over time, this silence became a form of inheritance, passed down through gestures, hesitations, and the subtle ways children learned to read the shadows in their mother's eyes. In many regions, the first generation after Conquest lived in the grip of fear, struggling to rebuild homes in streets that still carried the echoes of violence. Women who had been dragged from those very streets returned altered, their steps measured, their voices subdued, their eyes tracing the contours of a world that no longer resembled the one they had known. Some carried the physical marks of what they had endured. Others bore invisible scars that shaped the rhythms of their lives. Their families, unsure how to hold their grief, sometimes turned inward, creating an atmosphere where certain questions were never asked and certain topics never crossed the threshold of conversation. This silence did not mean the trauma had vanished. It meant it had seeped into the foundations of daily life. Children grew up sensing that their homes held secrets, that the sudden tears of a grandmother or the rigid stillness of a mother revealed more than they were allowed to understand. These children learned early how to interpret emotion without explanation, how to comfort without context, and how to carry burdens that were never explicitly given to them. The trauma became woven into lullabies, in the way voices softened at night, in the warnings parents passed down about dangerous places or dangerous men. The lessons were practical on the surface, but beneath them lay the memory of what had once been done to the women of the city. As decades became centuries, the stories transformed. Some were reshaped into myths of supernatural beings haunting the ruins of old districts, tales meant to keep children from wandering into unsafe areas. Others became folk songs filled with metaphors of storms and vanished flowers, disguising real events beneath layers of poetic symbolism. Communities preserved these memories not through historical accounts, but through cultural fragments that allowed them to speak of suffering without confronting it directly. In this way, trauma became both preserved and concealed, protected by the very silence that had once been forced upon them. But not all memories survived in these softened forms. Some dissolved entirely, erased by the empire's systematic suppression of conquered identities, lost in burned archives or overwritten by new political narratives. In regions where conquerors remained for generations, the original stories of violence faded until only hints remained. An old proverb, a ritual with unclear origins, the name of a street that no longer matched its purpose. The women who had endured the first wave of suffering became ghosts in the historical record, their experiences surviving only in the emotional patterns of their descendants. Occasionally, a fragment resurfaced, a brittle manuscript tucked into a forgotten chest, a confession written by a monk who had heard the stories secondhand, or an imperial document listing the number of captives processed without acknowledging the agony behind the numbers. These glimpses reveal how deeply the trauma had penetrated the social fabric, shaping not just personal lives, but the character of entire communities. Through these scattered traces, one begins to see that the true legacy of conquest was not merely the destruction of cities or the redrawing of borders, but the quiet, enduring pain carried by generations of women whose voices were deliberately silenced. Their stories, though rarely preserved in the chronicles of kings, remained embedded in the cultural memory of their people, waiting for the rare moment when history would pause long enough to listen. The silence that followed generations of invasions created an illusion that the past had been buried. But beneath that fragile quiet lived the truth of a world reshaped by the suffering of women whose stories were never meant to reach us. Empires wrote grand accounts of their victories, sculpted monuments to celebrate their dominance, and preserved the names of commanders who claimed to bring order to lands they had shattered. Yet the real history, the one that unfolded behind closed doors and within trembling households, remained hidden under layers of forced forgetting. What these conquerors did to the women of invaded cities was never an accident of war. It was a pattern repeated across continents and centuries, a method refined with each campaign, a dark tool woven into the very fabric of imperial expansion. As new generations rose, they inherited not only rebuilt cities but also the emotional architecture shaped by these long-concealed events. A daughter might grow up sensing the restraint in her mother's gaze without ever knowing its origin. A grandmother's trembling hand might betray the echoes of a trauma she never dared to name. Communities carried these invisible fractures into rituals, into alliances, into the way they treated outsiders or clung to their own. Even when the conquerors themselves vanished from the region, their legacy persisted in the structure of families and the caution embedded in cultural memory. The violence inflicted on women became the invisible blueprint through which conquered societies learned to navigate their rebuilt world. But perhaps the most revealing truth lies in how deliberately these stories were erased. Empires understood that acknowledging the full extent of their brutality would expose the fragility of their own authority. So documents were destroyed, testimonies suppressed, and the experiences of women were relegated to silence. The few records that survived do so almost by accident, scattered in places where the empire's reach faltered or its administrators were careless. A stray ledger detailing the distribution of captives, a marginal note written by a scribe who could not ignore what he witnessed, or a confession from a commander haunted by the memory of what his own soldiers had done. These glimpses, though sparse, reveal the depth of a truth the empire fought to keep hidden. And yet, across time, pieces of these stories resurfaced in unexpected ways. A ceremonial song whose meaning had changed, but whose melody carried the echo of mourning. A local custom warning women not to walk near a specific gate at dusk, its true origin forgotten but its purpose preserved. these fragments became the quiet guardians of a history that refused to disappear completely. They remind us that what happened to the women of conquered cities shaped far more than the military outcome of a conflict. It shaped the emotional inheritance of entire peoples. As we reach this point in the narrative, the threads begin to reveal the scale of what was lost and what survived, despite everything. And if you arrived here with me, it means you carried the weight of this truth through every step, through every shadowed detail, through every unspoken wound left by empires that built their glory on erased voices. Before we close this chapter, take a moment to think about the value of uncovering stories that were never meant to be told. If this journey resonated with you, consider subscribing so you stay connected to investigations like this one. And leave a comment saying, "This message was for me, so I know you reached the end with me." Your like also helps reinforce that these stories matter and deserve to be heard. There is another video here that deepens this hidden history, so follow that path and continue with me as we uncover what the past tried so hard to keep in the dark.